Welcome back to the Family and Beyond podcast I Wish series. I'm your host, Bim Delalu, family lawyer, qualified mediator, and legal coach. In the last episode, we talked about how conflict shapes children, even when parents believe they're shielding them. Here's the deeper truth we often avoid. Those experiences don't stay in childhood. They settle into the nervous system. They shape what feels safe, what feels familiar, and what love means. They show up in adults who care deeply but struggle to stay present, who over-explains or shuts down in an argument, or who chooses silence to keep the peace. They learn early that closeness can feel unpredictable, that love can require self-protection, that feeling too deeply can be a problem. Unhealed trauma doesn't live in the past. It lives in our bodies, in our reactions, in our relationships. It shows up in how we argue, how we withdraw, how we cling, and how we slowly lose ourselves inside relationships. And many people don't recognize this until they're exhausted, feeling emotionally numb, or quietly asking, why does this love feel so hard? Why do I make these choices? Today's episode is called The Impact of Unhealed Trauma in Relationships. What I Wish I Knew. This isn't about blame. It's about the trauma we adapted to survive and what happens or what becomes possible when we finally stop carrying this alone, when we decide to seek help, choose self-awareness, and take the next step. When people hear the word trauma, they often think of something extreme, something obvious. But trauma isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like growing up in a home where conflict was never resolved, where silence replaced communication, where emotions weren't safe to express, or where a child had to grow up too quickly. Trauma is not only what happened to you, it's what you had to adapt to in order to survive. Unhealed trauma rarely announces itself. It doesn't show up saying, hey, this is trauma. It shows up as patterns in people. So it looks like emotional distance. It looks like avoidance. It shows up as defensiveness, people pleasing, control, fear of abandonment. I'm going to share with you two composite examples here. The first one being the abandonment pattern. I've worked with individuals who experience abandonment early in life. Having a parent who left, was emotionally unavailable, was inconsistent, demanding, difficult to please or communicate with. So as adults, they desperately want connection. But when intimacy deepens, something inside them panics. They pull away. They become distant. They avoid difficult conversations. They struggle to stay present. Their partner experiences this as rejection or indifference. But underneath is a nervous system that learned early that connection is not safe, that people leave, and love doesn't override that lesson. Awareness and healing will do that. Now, let's talk about another common pattern, the people pleaser. This is the person who learned early that conflict wasn't safe. Expressing needs caused tension. Keeping the peace meant survival. So they adapt. They become agreeable. They minimize their needs. They overfunction emotionally, carrying the emotional labor in their relationships. So in relationships, they often say, it's fine, even when it's not. They feel resentful, but struggle to voice it. They lose themselves trying to keep things calm. From the outside, they look supportive, patient, and understanding. Inside, they are exhausted. And over time, resentment builds. Not because they weren't loved, but because they didn't feel seen.
There's another one called parentification.
When a child grows up early, being emotionally relied on by a parent, love becomes linked to responsibility. Think about that for a second. Care becomes something they give, not something they receive. And this has profound impact on adult intimacy. As adults, people who were parentified often want closeness. but they feel uneasy when someone truly shows up for them. Being cared for feels unfamiliar, feels uncomfortable, even unsafe. They wonder, am I asking for too much? Am I being a burden? So instead of leaning in, they overfunction. They become the emotional caretaker. They anticipate needs. They smooth over conflict. They give support even without asking for anything in return. So over time, intimacy becomes one-sided. They're very good at loving others, but unsure of how to receive love without guilt. Some people push others away emotionally, not because they don't care, but because closeness triggers an old fear of being needed too much. Some say in a relationship where their value comes from being useful or supportive, because that's the role they learned early on. But being needed is not the same as being loved. And this is where resentment quietly builds. They feel unseen, they are emotionally tired, and stepping back from this responsibility feels like abandonment. When trauma driven patterns go unaddressed, they don't just create conflict, they quietly dismantle connection. Connection requires emotional presence. Hear that. Intimacy requires safety, and trauma often interrupts both. Over time, partners stop reaching for each other, not because they don't care, but because it no longer feels safe. One partner may feel chronically unseen, they share less, they stop asking, they begin to protect themselves from disappointment. The other partner may feel chronically overwhelmed. Every conversation feels like this is too much. So they withdraw, not to hurt, but to survive. And in that space, intimacy disappears and loneliness grows even when they're still together. Let's talk about the ripple effect. Okay. This is where today's conversation connects directly back to episode 3. Unhealed trauma doesn't just impact romantic partners, it shapes family dynamics. Children learn how to attach, regulate emotions, and resolve conflict by watching the adults around them. And as we discussed last episode, children tend to absorb tension even when nothing is said. Children are exquisitely attuned to emotional shifts, whether we believe it or not. Because they're wired for connection, they would feel everything that you think they don't. So they often internalize this tension. They assume responsibility. They learn to stay quiet, to stay small, or stay alert. And long before they have words for it, their nervous system begins adapting to instability. Here are some truths many people learn too late. You cannot love someone into healing. Patience does not replace accountability. Trauma explains behavior. It does not excuse harm. Understanding someone's past does not require sacrificing yourself. And staying out of guilt is not the same as staying out of love. And most importantly, if someone is unwilling to acknowledge their trauma, to seek support or take responsibility for how this impacts others, no amount of love would make the relationship sustainable. I want to end with this. The truth is that you cannot love someone into healing. Understanding someone's past or your past is essential, but it doesn't require or mean sacrificing your own well-being. Awareness brings choice. So choose boundaries, choose healing, welcome accountability. Again, unhealed trauma doesn't stay in the past, but awareness gives us a choice. Choice to seek support, choice to set boundaries, choice to stop repeating patterns that quietly erode connection for ourselves, for our partners, and our families. This has been episode 4 of the I Wish series, The Impact of Unhealed Trauma in Relationships, What I Wish I Knew. Thank you for being there and for willing to reflect, not with judgment, but with honesty. So, until next time, this is Bim Delalu. If this episode resonated with you, I invite you to reflect, share it thoughtfully, or continue the conversation with curiosity rather than judgment. Knowing that understanding trauma doesn't mean accepting disconnection as inevitable, and it doesn't mean enduring relationships that slowly erase you. So keep listening, reflecting, and choosing awareness over blame. Until the next time, this is Family and Beyond. the Irish series.